bit about me. I was born in Middlebury, Vermont a long time ago, and I've spent much of my time outdoors hiking and biking, and I'm just an outdoor person. And I think one of the things I learned a long time ago is that Vermont ain't flat by traveling around like that. And what I did discover, what goes up and up will eventually do what? Goes up more. The traditional thing, but you come around a corner on your bike or if you're hiking, I assure you it's going to go up some more. That's a little bit about me, and I said today I've talked, and I'll review a little bit where I left off last week. That's, thank you. First part of Vermont is I was called a European invasion when the Europeans arrived in the 1600s. That's Plymouth Rock. And on the left, what you can't see very well, is Samuel Champlain in 1609 when he brought a gun to a bow and arrow fight. But as the Europeans were coming here, France was trying to develop from the St. Lawrence down. The English and the British and the Dutch was using the coastal lines and traveling with that. But what they brought worse than that gun was they brought the diseases that they had built up resistance to in Europe, and actually the smallpox and other things killed, I think I read as much as 3/4 of the Indian population. That's what we brought over there. Obviously they had different opinions of how to use this land and stuff. Essentially, I will call us, we were squatters. This is probably a 1750s vintage of what New England looked like, and you won't see any distinction between New Hampshire and Vermont. And this is, I was talking about that European development, the Dutch going up the Hudson, the coastal entries into where Boston is and Charles and the rivers and stuff. And it was during this development, you know, the coastal areas and stuff developed much quicker and faster than this rural wilderness up here that we now know as Vermont. And when you first started doing that, this is the first settlement that was known to be in Vermont. It was called Fort Dumner, named after Dummer. There was even a Dummer's War. But this is how you carved your existence out in the wilderness against the Indians and removing the forest. And if you look closely at that, those are houses in there. Those are names of people who were the residents at that time. But as you, in these early 1700s, that's how you moved to Vermont. That's how you got in here and took on the savages and the Indians along with the timber. What's that?
Why would you move?
Well, because that's a good question. Because of land, and they needed that land to survive, and then there's more generations of people, so they need more land, but you can't create more land, so they would migrate to what's uninhabited land, the wilderness. And the reason it was a wilderness here is because it wasn't accessible as southern New England. But that's a good question. It was about acquiring land for your own wealth and to raise your families, because now you got where there was maybe, once you've got several generations, there are many more people trying to live on that same piece of land. This was unoccupied up here except for a few Indians. And how you did this is they moved up to Connecticut, they built these forts, these compounds like this. And I want to tell a story. There's Fort number 4 is across from, it's in Charleston, New Hampshire, across from Springfield, Vermont, Chester, Vermont actually. It's just over the border, and that's another fort that goes up the thing. And this is, I'm going to give you a little bit about what really was going on at that time. This is Fort number 4, and I'm just showing that little red diamond is where Reading, Vermont is. Anybody know where Reading, Vermont is? Anybody know anything about the Indian stones? I think Violet does. But anyway, poking around on my bike as I do oftentimes, and I did bike to all the towns in Vermont, all 251 of them, and you get a better look at your surroundings in Vermont when you're traveling 10 miles an hour. Even though I've driven by here several times, I saw that iconic Vermont roadside sign, and it said Indian stones. And I said, I wonder what this is about. And as Violet knows, it's a beautiful little setting with lilac trees and stuff. But what it is, if you look to, in other words, from Fort number 4, okay, there was a family that was where the Indians broke in and they captured all the inhabitants in there, and they were on their way to Canada to ransom them off. Susanna Johnson, you know, after being captured by the Indians, soon gave birth to a daughter, and she survived all the hardships of that. And she and the rest of her family were taken up to Canada to be ransomed off. You know, that was the way of the Indians making a living, I guess, so to speak, and carving out their territory. But it's interesting, she gave birth to that daughter, survived all of that, and then 6 years later, she wrote quite an extensive, very elaborate journal and story about that. What should she have named her daughter? What would be a good name for that daughter? Captivity. But it's just, and this is just more of the harshness of what was going on. One of the oldest towns in Vermont is Westminster, Vermont. My editor picked up, I made a minister out of it. So, but anyway, there again, this development coming up out of southern New England and trying to develop these towns, and it was just a matter of expansion, whether it's Massachusetts Bay Colony or the Dutch and something coming east from over the Hudson. They were trying to establish towns. And Westminster was kind of interesting because it was originally, in other words, it belonged to Massachusetts in 1734. Massachusetts wasn't really all, they kind of got disinterested in developing north because of the forts and what it took to do that. So they were fine with giving up the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so it got turned over to New Hampshire. So it became, in 1734, it was a Massachusetts Bay Colony town, and then it was a New Hampshire grant in 1752. And all that turmoil that was going on more on the western side of the state, with New York claiming the same lands that eventually turned out into Vermont, there wasn't quite as much fight and argue about that and who owned the land and who it belonged to, but that was really what was going on with East and Allen on the western side of the state, but not so much on the eastern side of the state. And there was a little bit of ambiguity what was going on. King George, who had other things to take care of along the way, including the Revolutionary War, never really declared whether New York's border was the Hudson or just a little east of the Hudson, or if it was over at the Connecticut River, which he declared finally in 1762. And it became a New York patent. And anyway, there was a fight that broke out there or whatever, but this is the first town, the oldest town in Vermont, established in 1734. Now let's get back to Bennington. Bennington Wentworth is the one that wanted to, he was pretty ambitious, and this was about making himself rich, and he just started claiming land that wasn't necessarily belonged to him, that ambiguous language. And so anyway, he first said, and imagine that, he named it Bennington after himself. But the first New Hampshire land grant that was started to develop Vermont was Bennington, and that was granted in 1749. People didn't start moving to this region until after the French and Indian War, which is another part of this story, in 1761, when the hostilities of that settled down and they didn't have to live protected from the Indians. The land was more open and available, and that's when our early pioneers started arriving in southern Vermont. And as I said, as we travel through here, I'm just going through quickly what we went through the last time that we were here. So, from the land grants from New Hampshire to the New York patents to the land claim both by New York and New Hampshire, Vermont became a state. Vermont declared this is our land. We were able to accomplish that. But then we were 14 years, which we were not part of the continental United States. We're an independent sovereign nation. But through a lot of negotiation back and forth, plus writing a check to the state of New York for $30,000, we became the 14th state in 1791. So, and also if you look down here, that's, anyway, let me just move on. So where do those 251 towns originate from? I've given you a little bit of the background to that. That Bennington Wentworth granted 129 towns. There were 3 that were still kind of held over from the New York patents. The Massachusetts Bay Colony were the original grantors of that land. And then as we developed as our own state, there were a lot of charters and grants and acts of incorporation. And as the Vermont grew north, and there were a lot of this, some land was awarded to war heroes and other people. But one of the things when Bennington Wentworth made his first land grant, the towns, and I don't know why, were 6 miles square. You're trying, as you ride around, you get to towns, and all of a sudden there's a mountain in the way. Something I'll explain to how some towns got switched over because of the geographical challenge to it. But just to tell you, in other words, Essex County up there, which is the county that's shown there on the right, with all those towns you see there, What's the population, you suppose, of that entire county? The size of St. Albans, Vermont, 6,300 people. That's an entire county. And if you look at where I'm talking about Lewis, there's me and my grandsons and I when we did the 251 towns a while back. That picture represents, we represent 3 more people than the entire population of Lewis. What's that math tell you? 0. And if you take those 3 contiguous towns and move north, it's Averill, Lewis, and you know what the other one is? Ferdinand. Those, now they're sick of the land, 6 by 6 square, 3 of those counties in a row. 58 people live entirely in those 3 towns. A lot of Vermont, when you get out some of these rural places, is just a strip of road going through a town. That's all it is. There's nothing else. It's rural. 6,300 people, the size of St. Albans. And another part that if I had the ability to have a 1700s picture, it would be to the left of the one that's in the black and white. But when the pioneers and people came up here and they started carving Vermont out of the wilderness and doing the things they had to do, I think the thing I always find is when that couple arrived up here and there's trees about this big, and the missus says, "I want the garden right there." Well, they didn't have excavators and chainsaws. Many strokes fell the mighty oaks. But all of this land that was cleared, and what I'm point I'm making is, when they got here in the early 1700s, Vermont was 75% forested. And then by the time we got through doing all the things and clearing and opening up things, particularly the height of sheep farming, which is in the 1820s, because Vermont was producing, with the merino sheep, the best, most desired wool that was worldwide desirable. So everybody got into sheep farming, and sheep farming, you know, they cleared up. You can see pictures of this valley, you know, with the forest cleared, you know, 2/3 of the way up Equinox. But here, 150 years later, it's back to 75% forestry. As the farms got abandoned, the animals got abandoned. If you look closely at this picture, you can determine that it actually is the same picture. The picture to the right maybe is swung over 10 degrees, and there's a little bit of a knoll that's on the left of the colored picture, where the knoll is in the center of the other picture. And if you look down there, you can see that same barn that exists there. But that's what happened in Vermont when we did all of this and cleared all the forest and did whatever the economy could do. What was the first, anyway, I guess we'll get to that when we get to that patent, Dick. But anyway, that's what we've transitioned to, and I think at this point maybe we're even going back the other way. I don't see what's going to clear our forest any faster, but it's pretty interesting to find sweet border, I mean, go from 25% to 75% back to this. If you have any questions, you can, as I babble on, you can interrupt me and ask. I'll try to answer them.
Dick?
It's a thing called the railroad, which is kind of interesting. As this nation developed, and if you look at the population swings in Vermont, many small towns would peak around 1820 or 1830 because of the sheep farming. And it's interesting, when the railroads came here, it did 2 things. It opened up our dairy farmers to the Boston market to get the milk in Boston, but also opened up the western market to sheep farming, which was more open and wide open. So markets go wherever it's cost effective. It doesn't matter whether it's marble or sheep or goat. So that's whenever we're changing all those things. And a little bit on that population swing. I'll get to Guilford in a minute. But anyway, that's what it would have done. So once all that, the prosperity of that left. And with that did a lot of people. So we started migrating away from these towns. Guildhall, which I'll get to in a second, in other words, when it peaked, there's a lot of towns, if you go through them, and if you look at the population history, many of them peaked at 1820 or 1830 time, and then went down and down and down, and really never reached those population levels, and many still haven't, until the 60s. And what happened in the 60s? Along with a few hippie invasions or something. No, but really what it was, you know, was the interstate, the development of ski areas, and there was that back to land movement. But it's interesting, you can look at that and you'll see a population dwindle down to about the 40s, start to creep up a little bit, And there's many communities that have never reached. They're just little rural communities, and I said just drive-by towns, there's lots of that. Sure.
Following was the clearing just for sheep, or was there timber involved, and were there fires after the clearing?
Not so much on the fires, but that was a resource that was here. When these pioneers started doing that, what did the king do with all the straight, big, tall trees?
Ship's mast.
Ship's mast, good answer. In other words, he claimed that or whatever. So in other words, it was a twofold process. We got to get if we're going to have the garden there, we got to get the trees out of there. And that byproduct was lumber, it was fuel, and they put it in great big piles sometimes just to burn it and just get rid of it, which also created one of our earliest sources of money, revenue. But it was a process of all of that. Much of it was used for many things, but a lot of it was just piled up in a pile just to get rid of it and burn it to get it out of the way. And because the king needed those masts, because Europe didn't have any trees left by then. Now we're in independent Vermont and Bethel. See, I did drive to some of these towns. I did get my bike there. But Bethel, once Vermont was as an independent republic, not a state yet, started granting towns, and for different reasons. And it's interesting if you look at that county picture, and that's Bethel, it's marked there. For whatever reason, I have no idea where the 6 square mile format came from, but it was continued throughout the rest of the development of Vermont. So this is the state, the independent republic of Vermont. Bethel was the very first one that was awarded in 1779. And then we talked about that bike ride in geography. Anybody know where West Town is? Weston. Or Baltimore. Who knows where Baltimore is? It's not Maryland in this case. But that's that little sliver, in other words, you got to realize that when these land grants were being made, and we bought our piece of property or our lot, okay, we didn't know if it was a cliff, we didn't know if it was a swamp, you know. But also when we traveled back in those days, we did it with horse and buggy. So in East Dorset and Dorset is a little bit familiar to that. While there's 2 communities, for a couple of reasons, was Morse Hill was in the way. So when you talk about Hawks Mountain or Terrible Mountain, which I've ridden a bike up over, and it is terrible. So if you had to go to town meeting and you traveled 2 or 3 miles an hour and you had to get over a mountain, you wouldn't get there in time to turn around. So that's a lot of those changes, those acts of incorporation. So it's been some places where towns are just carved off geographically mostly, but there could be some other things. Of course, there's different commerces. And also, even though there were these 6-mile squares, the development of the towns was often compass points. Dorset's a perfect example. East Dorset, North Dorset, centers, intersections or whatever. Those little developed pockets have developed, you know, throughout the state, just where there was a little bit of commerce and a little bit of traffic going through. And then, among other things, I picked a couple of towns that have some history we can talk about. And there again, I am with 2 little boys at the Middlebury College Snowball. And this is the town of Hancock. Some of you might be familiar with that, know where it is. Well, Middlebury College Snowball, it's on the mountain, you know, heading out of Middlebury. But they have one of the more unique things that I know about that occurs in Vermont. And it's called the February Ski Down. Anyone ever heard of it? Well, it's a unique experience because the Middlebury College class that really graduates in the midterm, you know, in February, to get their diploma, okay, they have to slide or ski down, ski lift to get it. They do it with tubes and all kinds of things. It's something that's featured on Channel 3 every year. I think it's a unique tradition. Obviously, they get to graduate with the other kids in June or something. Actually, it's Memorial Day they graduate. But that's just a tradition that's been going on forever. And that little boy, that cute little boy, I think in the middle of that picture, when he heard his grandfather tell this story about the ski down, and that's where you would ski down and kind of get your diploma. He has a raspy little voice or something, and when I asked him, he would go to explain it to me, he says, "They, the people, slide down a hill and get a prize called a diploma." I don't know if the college is using those terms yet or whatever. And then also the second time through on my bike, I'm there again, also in Hancock. And what did John Hancock say? Why did John Hancock write his signature like that? And what did he say after he signed it? Some of you might know that.
Something like so the British could read it.
Make sure that the king could read it without his spectacles.
Yeah.
That's what it was. He wanted to make sure, and believe me, he's putting his neck in the news. All of those signers, the 55 signers, essentially put their neck in the news. But John Hancock says, I'm all over this, you know, but he did that to see with his spectacles. And then actually when I was doing my bike tour, how I biked all the way around Vermont, I go to campgrounds and I do a section and ride around and do this. And as this ride I want to take up, which is going to include the town, to see with his spectacles. And then actually when I was doing my bike tour, how I biked all the way around Vermont, I go to campgrounds and I do a section and ride around and do this. And as this ride I want to take up, which is going to include the town of Hancock. If you look closely at my hitchhiking wife there, the thumb, she's got a big white bandage on there. And as we were camping at Gifford Woods and I'm getting my stuff gathered up and getting ready to head up and do a bunch of towns, no idea how she did this, okay? And I'm loading the bike and I'm getting ready to do some stuff and getting it packed up, and she says, you're not going to be too happy with me. I think we've all heard that before.
Then you wait.
Then you wait. You don't move, first of all. And believe it or not, I've been busy for 15 minutes. And what she had been doing while I was doing that, and she'd been told a million times to not do that, and I'm sure some of you ladies had been told it, don't split wood. Don't split wood. Well, so she's got that thumb, and a chunk of the thumb over here also. But just a little trip to the hospital or whatever, but there she was. She wanted to go out and drop me off and be a part of the activities for the day. For some strange reason, she must have felt obligated because she held my ride up by an hour and a half, and we went to Rutland Hospital. So I guess there was no reason to not let her do that. But if you travel around Vermont, you will every town's got a unique little story. There's always something that's interesting. And then of course some of these towns, they were just awarded to war heroes. Thomas Chittenden, by the way, Freedom and Unity, Thomas Chittenden wrote that. That was one of the questions last night with some of the Vermont slogans or something. But it's Thomas Chittenden who wrote that slogan. But because Ira Allen and Thomas Chittenden were really certainly the most visible people carving out Vermont, and then started winning things, there's some towns named after them. Ira Allen has got Alberg, Irisburg, Barton, and Fairhaven. And then Thomas Chittenden even got a county. But he has towns of Chittenden, Cambridge, Fairhaven, Jamaica, and Jay. But these are some of the things, and we'll go through there. And a lot of other towns, in other words, were awarded to war heroes and stuff. Language here, but a few of the grants were awarded to heroes and revolutionary stalwarts. Any of you familiar with North Hero, Grand Island, South Hero? They're called the Islands. They're called the Heroes. That was awards to Ethan Allen and a bunch of others, that whole landmass. Which when you think of what was there, 364 of them, seems like a lot of people have carved that up. But that piece of property essentially would be 6 miles wide and 20 miles long. So there would have been a lot of room for that. Another, General Montgomery, who was killed in the siege of Quebec, okay? Anyway, he has a town named after him. Warren is Joseph Warren. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of him, down at the Battle of Bunker Hill. It's interesting that he was, even though he was an officer, seems like this, which I enjoy. This one happens to be above tree line because it's above 4,000 feet. But as you walk through here, this is Mount Abraham. There's a 25 bonus point question at the end here. Lincoln Mountain, Mount Grant, Cleveland, Roosevelt, and Wilson. Now, who in the heck would Nancy Hanks be?
Tom Hanks.
That's a good answer, because there was part of that as I was doing the research, it did mention Tom Hanks. She's the mother to one of those presidents. Not entirely sure why she got awarded that, but she would be Abraham Lincoln's mom. But I think if you look through here and you go through this range, these mountain ranges in the town, particularly mountain ranges, obviously a lot of them go back to Indian names. But anyway, there was just that period of time where they were just awarding the heroes. And actually when I went through here, John Stark, you might be familiar with, General John Stark. And I'm not sure why I started this trek when I'm hiking the long trail. We'll get off. I guess there's still towns up on top of the mountain, right? I know they are. But I start off with, well, Ethan got the taller mountain than his younger brother, Ira. And then I came to Molly Stark Mountain, Stark's Nest, Stark, or whatever, and I was just really surprised that General John Stark would got that much attention up there. And by the way, there is a town named after him, Starksboro. All of his activities happened down here in Bennington County or southern Vermont, but certainly he got his tributes up there. And another thing is you poke around Vermont very slowly, particularly on a bike or something. That's something I'm just absolutely enamored with are all the Greek revivals that have been salvaged over these years. Many of them are used today. Some without electricity, water, but they've just been built. And they were built around 1850-ish. And a lot of that was about, maybe we were getting a little bit of, by the 1820s, a little bit of prosperity. The sheep farmers were getting their dividends, and we began to have a little bit of prosperity instead of just plain surviving. But if you travel throughout Vermont, these will be there, particularly when they're in small towns, they still have their place, and often they would be in groups of 3, probably a couple of dominations, meeting house or whatever. Many are used today, as I said, some may be without water and sewer, there might be wedding venues. The one that's over in Rockingham, anybody ever seen the meeting house in Rockingham? That is just magnificent, isn't it? And it's just perfectly set up high up on that hill or whatever. I believe the town select board, I think they have one meeting in there.
Yeah.
I think you would, yeah. But it's just one of those things with a burial ground out back, and this is just typical. There's Athens, which is the name of a town that was named after that. But a lot of this was about, we had enough of Europe because we've been battling them since the 1770s, and even after the War of 1812, we're still battling them or something. But I think nationally, too, our country was enamored with the Greek architecture and the Greek revivals. That's why we have so many of them. And that one on the right is in Cornwall, Vermont, and out back of that is what I call the old burial ground, specifically as you see up there in Rockingham. And these are gravestones that go back to the late 1700s. And then that one in the middle, anybody familiar with that one? That's Middlebury. Coming from Middlebury College. Oh, you know what? I can see it, but you can't. How's that? I'm this type of equipment challenge. I'm better off with a hammer and a saw and a backpack, pushing buttons. No wonder, but thank you for that. I just want to see if you're still paying attention. But nobody's left yet anyway. That's the Congregational Church in Middlebury.
Wow.
And there's a couple of stories that I could share with that about that. But that really sits up on a hill. It's just magnificent. There was the time that Middlebury was competing to be the premier location in Vermont. It had a population equal to or more than Burlington at that time. It's interesting. We know that UVM was the first college through Ira Allen to be granted. In other words, the first college that was granted. Middlebury College, that was about 1790. Middlebury College in 1800 was also formed. But they had students before UVM did, University of Vermont. And part of it was a little bit of controversy here. Ira Allen gave them the land. There's the Ira Allen Chapel, and it's very well noted up there. But he didn't have whatever money he pledged. And they kept asking him for it, and he was a little bit disenchanted with that or whatever. So he took his 2 boys down to a Gamaliel painter at Middlebury College and had them educated there. But also, a couple of things, you look at that. I grew up in Middlebury. I'm not so entirely sure I've grown up yet, but I started there, and I just use that too. And there's 2 things about this setting in that church. As a youngster, back then when you were 11, 12 years old, we had the freedom of just roaming around streets kids did at that time. There didn't seem to be any concern of it. And I think most of us probably had certain rules of what time you had to be home or in the house or be home in time for supper. Well, that nasty church over there had church chimes that went off at 6 o'clock. Guess what time I was supposed to be home at the table?
6 o'clock.
Well, how many times do you suppose I raced through the streets of Middlebury trying to beat those chimes? And if I was a little bit late, just think of your siblings, how much fun that is for them, because I got to do the dishes. And they got to go, yeah, you know, laugh. But also, I have a couple of grandsons that have now, those little boys I showed you a little earlier, in their 20s. But I got to grow up there again with them, you know, when they were 7, 8, 9 years old. We'd hike and walk all over the college and stuff, go to the hockey games. And where this picture, I'm sure where this picture is taken, the guy standing right smack dab in the middle of the bridge that goes over Otter Creek. And that's the Battelle building to the right, which is another interesting person, Joseph Battelle. But anyway, my grandson's about 8 or 9 years old, and we've walked all over town, and he's shown me some things that he's learned as a youngster growing up. And we stopped at, in other words, just to the building on the left is where the end of the limestone is for the bridge. It was built in the early 1800s. And he showed me the fossils that were at the end of that. Somewhere in whatever he was learning in history, someone showed him that. He's 8 or 9 years old, and I say to Zach, he can be a little pensive. How old are those fossils? They're pretty old. Probably as old as you. That's the truth. Probably as old as me. There was something else here. Oh, and the other thing I talked about, that sheep farming. An interesting thing I told you is land gets switched around. You have to realize, some of you probably are familiar with Middlebury College campus. Well, Middlebury's town line in Cornwall, which is the town where the next town south, the border used to be the Otter Creek. But they had really developed their town center, that one of the church, the meeting house that I showed you in Cornwall a little while ago, is about 3 miles, at least 3 miles south of there, where a couple of roads come together. That's usually a lot of where towns were developed, where there was water power and sometimes some intersections. And Middlebury was developing pretty fast on the falls. And anyway, somewhere along the way, probably a little shrewd maneuvering or something, Cornwall ceded about those 2 or 3 miles of land to Middlebury, Vermont. Okay, so that became part of Middlebury, and their border drew down. But my grandson tells me that somewhere in I'm not sure where he picked this up, but because you are now in Cornwall and you wanted to get your sheep or cattle across the bridge, you can still do that today. You can drive your sheep and cattle across that Otter Creek Bridge without paying a fee. See, you should probably try that. See how that would go. Some of you might remember we had a cattle drive here. Any of you remember the cattle drive in the 60s? Or maybe, yeah, Ivan Beatty or Orrin Beatty?
Coming from the Punch Bowl up to their place.
Yeah. Yeah, in other words, from down on River Road. Because I do remember that. I was living here then, so it's after the early 60s or something. But anyway, we had a cattle drive that went from down in Richville, or yeah, down by Richville, all the way up to, like I said, his farm in Barnumville. Yeah, so we did have a cattle drive here.
What was the purpose?
Get the cows here. I didn't mean to be rude, but that's how things were done. That's why I'm talking about getting the purpose of getting the sheep and the cattle across the bridge. Because that's what you did. When you want to get your animals to market or move them from somewhere, as you drove them, you didn't have tractor trailers, you didn't have any other way to do it. So just, I think, part of the novelty of it. Orrin probably had, what do you suppose it could have been, 40, 50 head of cattle in there? I know Sean's got a picture of it coming up up
Highland Avenue.
Yeah, Highland Avenue. So you've got farmers and stuff, you got all these cows in a long line, 5 or 6 miles. Part of the novelty of it, but today you would just put them in a tractor trailer and just haul them. But that's how you did that. Just like you did in this period of time, if you wanted to get your beef or whatever to market, how'd you get them to Boston? You drove them. You know, and that was just a cattle drive. It's just not a Wild West thing. And another little story. My grandfather, probably born about 1885, used to tease us kids with these stories about a turkey drive, driving turkeys. That's what we all thought, driving turkeys. Zero chance, right? And we just knew that he was teasing us and pulling our leg. Well, recently, I'll think of his name in a minute, just wrote a book. It's always, and then again. You might remember, help me remember that author, but he's always writing historical things about it. A book that probably came out about a year ago, and he tells an absolute true tale about driving the turkeys to Boston. So he was not teasing us. I'm not so sure that he was entirely on one. And I think the interesting thing about that, if you've ever been around turkeys or chickens, what do they do when, yeah, they're not easy to manage. But what do they do at dark? Yeah, they just go to bed. I mean, it's dark. I mean, like when I'm hiking or doing some stuff and on camera, I like to say living like the chickens. I get up at dawn, go to bed at dark. I mean, what else are you going to do? As they were driving these turkeys to Boston, what happened when they got to covered bridges? Roost. They went to roost. It was dark. And they would physically have to pick them up and carry them through. I wonder how meaty and tasty that bird was when they got to Boston.
Really tender.
Really tender. That was the true thing. Of course, people would throw their turkeys in the mix, and some people would probably try to pilfer some turkeys or something, but it actually did happen. That's the Greek revival. This is the one on the left is that's the town of Franklin, Vermont, in Franklin County, kind of up in the north central part of the state. If you went much further, you'd be in Canada. But this is what I'm talking about. There were so many of these structures. These are kind of regal-like up on a hill. But oftentimes, when you're in the town centers and town greens, you'll see these Greek revivals. Within an acre or something. You know, I mean, obviously things were closed to denominate, you know, whatever it was, but that's how communities develop. But I just think they're magnificent buildings, and to have so many of them saved from the fire and restored, and we still have them, is just incredible. But these are, and they'll show up in these towns, these small towns, because they're not dwarfed by anything else. Nothing. They haven't been crowded out by other things. They just stand there just exactly looking like this. And sometimes there'll be libraries or still meeting houses. Calais, Vermont, I think up until about 3 or 4 years ago, and finally decided they had to rebuild it and whatever, probably in one of these types of buildings, had town meetings there for almost like 130 years. And I'm just looking at it. Calais, Vermont would have developed where the lake is and where the road is, Route 14, but the real center of the town was is off to the east, off on a dirt road, and there was one of these Greek revival things, and that's where town meeting was up until a few years ago. You know, there wouldn't have been bathrooms, there was none of that. You know, that's where their town meeting is, these small towns. So some of those traditions. And then, our state capital should be one also. That church to the left is Andover. And there again, that's a small town. And one of the things I found traveling around, it's the Freeman Grant, some other things. These buildings are just being restored. These buildings of towns, maybe 600 or 700 or 800 people that live in them. And they often have new green stainless standing seam roofs or whatever. And as I said, I don't know, I'm just fascinated by them. And I know when I'm pulling along on the bike on the flat road and I see a steeple up on the hill, I know where I'm going, because that's going to be the center of the town. And then our state capitol should be one, and it is, and it just got a new dome on it, as a matter of fact. There's that guy on his bike again. Maybe I should share with you the first time I was there 12 or 13 years ago with those little boys that did the 251 town with me. The last time I was there, we were with, at that time, Governor Jim Douglas, Channel 3 TV. We had a whole presentation. If you ever watch the Channel 3 news, oftentimes they like to finish up with 5 minutes of a funny story or a fun story, and exactly what it was. So there's the TV crew, and this is the filmed at night or something, and Jim Douglas kind of scratching out our last town, coloring in our last town, and the segment finishes up, and my little grandson jumping up and high-fiving. A little quieter last time I went through there. Anybody know of a library in the United States that doesn't have books? Huh? How about Vermont? Could there be a library in Vermont without books? I bet there is. Huh?
E-books?
No, no books. No books.
Where?
In the United States, okay? And if you look at the red line or something there, anybody familiar with that building? The Haskell Free Library, which I was in recently, or with my bike or something. But the help desk is in Canada, or in the United States, and the books are in Canada. And upstairs there's an opera house, and it's a summer thing. The audience is in Vermont, and the players are in Canada. This was by design. It was built that way. Any of you ever got trapped, or maybe it's a little more of an incident now, of because you have to realize that is the border. There's a building there, so behind that building there are streets that are in Canada, and this side of the street you're in the United States. What happens when you...
I just wanted to say one phenomenon that's happening now in that building is that people that are have had asylum in Canada are meeting with their family members who live in the U.S. and the Canadians, you know, sit on the Canadian side, and that's how they get to meet with their family in the U.S.
I like that story better than one I was going to share. They smuggle guns through there. They've done that recently. But that's the absolute truth. I mean, you don't really... I'm not so sure. I don't remember seeing a line on the floor or something. But this is just an international border that's like that. And I'll tell a little story when I went through, when I was riding this bike and I went up through Norton, Vermont on the western side, and then went over to Averill and checking off those towns. And I decided I was going to take a town, a lot of the pictures I took were a town, they were libraries or town halls or whatever. And I said, you know, I think I want to get a picture of that sign saying that I was welcome to Canada. So I get my bike and I get it up there and I got a little tripod and I get the camera set up. And this nice handsome young man in uniform came down to talk to me. And yeah, uh-oh, what's happened here? I said, I bet I'm in Canada, aren't I? He says, yeah, when you went across that little ditch, you entered Canada. He says, just grab your bike and come up with me and we'll take care of this. That was the easy part. Okay? Because now I'm in Canada, guess where I got to go next? I got to get back to the United States. This guy saw my entire trip in Canada, right? He saw me do that, and a little traffic tied up. Fortunately for me, I had a license with me, my pocket. Remember, I'm on a bicycle. So now I got to go back through customs again. And I ran into a rather stern lady. Quite a little bit of time convincing her. Well, I think the biggest problem I had with her that she didn't quite accept was I had no idea if I'd ever had a passport. I've been out of the country a few times with my wife, but I don't get involved with those details. So I didn't really know if I'd ever had a passport or not. So she finds that a little incredulous. But it's interesting. She's typing along like this, and I said, yeah, I've done a couple of Disney cruises, and you know, and I'm still trying to explain to her that I'm just out for a bike ride and I just made a wrong turn. I think she's even called the other guy up in Canada, and she snaps around at me and says, where'd you go at such and such a time? I don't know where she got that from, but I said it must be that cruise. Somewhere along the way, and the fact that I had a Vermont license indicated that I was a U.S. citizen. But somewhere along the way, I guess you figured that old man on a bike was not a terrorist and let me go. It took a little bit of doing.
We could corroborate that story exactly.
Everybody's got one. Let's
we
hear it.
accidentally walked across, and we came back, and the same woman gave us the same trouble.
She was kind of stern.
Because she wanted our passports. We didn't have any.
Yep.
I know. So do you need a passport to go from the circulation desk to the book area?
I would say no, because I did that. I walked all through that library.
We have a wall.
Where was the first U.S. patent?
Yeah.
Anybody know where the first U.S. patent was? I got a picture of it.
Rutland.
Rutland, huh? That's actually Pittsford, Vermont, by Samuel Hopkins in 1790. Can't really see that, but you can see the X and the zeros and a 1. This is the first U.S. patent that was awarded to Samuel Hopkins. And I was telling you about burning up all that forest and all that type of stuff, where they learned to make lye and lye soap from it. And that just became a revenue stream, and you know how they could raise some money or something just with all that type of stuff. But he got a U.S. patent, the very first one, signed by Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Edmund Randall. But Vermont's got a unique history of that. Also, we got a few cities. Anybody, how many cities we got in Vermont?
251.
We got 251 towns. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between a city and a town. Is just a type of government. Type of government in cities is a mayor, and towns have, like we have here, you have a select board, you have council, you have some other things. But almost always exclusively, if you are a city, you have a mayor. And anybody know where the smallest city in the USA is?
No, I don't know the gens.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I had a question about the mayor, because I was just in Bennington and there's the sign, we want a mayor. Yeah, they don't
That's
have
right.
a mayor?
Yeah, that's it, no, because that's exactly, I'll go to that, let me just go to that list right now. These are the cities, and that's a good, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's what's going on. That every once in a while a town will say, do we want to change our type of government? Meaning you've got a mayor who actually is the boss of everything versus John O'Keefe, our town manager, his boss is a select board. No, there's just a little bit of how it functions. But you're right, every once in a while, in towns that'll pop up once in a while. If you look at the dates on here, South Burlington became a town only in 1971. But yeah, so there's some things, that these other towns you'll see, you got to realize that the towns typically were, there's one unique one on here for a couple of reasons, but the towns, most of our towns are in the 1790s, early 1800s, so it's 60 years, 50 years, 90 years before they became cities. But it's how it operates, but they do that. Every once in a while that pops up in Bennington. And yes, Virgins has always said it's the smallest city in the USA, but if you look at the dates on there and you get down to Virgins, 1788. So it was at, you know, I'm not entirely sure, I read a little bit of history, why they opted to be a city in 1788 where everybody else just wanted to be a town. But I think it could very well be, I've seen some language that said it was like the third or fourth town, or city in the country. But it's just a matter of government. Another interesting, so all of these towns, when you're familiar with Rutland and Rutland Town, and typically, it's a little bit like the village in Manchester Center here, there would be the towns, all of these towns, Rutland, Berry, St. Albans, there was a town chopped right out of the middle of that 6-mile square. So it's just a matter of different governments. They actually have different needs and interests. Rutland's a perfect example of that, where you've got the city of Rutland and you've got the rural surrounding town. So there's just two different governments. But it's interesting that I showed you all those Greek revivals, and I've talked about all these little towns that just grew up. I mean, if you go through and you see these 1850 buildings, these small towns that have that Greek revival, a meeting house, they have playgrounds and center parks and stuff. South Burlington has none of that. South Burlington, and I lived there in 1968 on Dorset Street, and it's a real busy place up there. But you got to realize that Burlington, which is the lakeside of it, in other words, what was originally Burlington City was carved out of that, and what was left over was South Burlington. Like in Rutland, what was carved out is Rutland City, the rest around it was Rutland Town. So all the commerce, all those things that went on in Burlington, South Burlington's never had a downtown. They don't have a Greek revival, they don't have a town center, they don't have an old burial ground, and they're trying awfully hard, probably for the last few decades, to do just that. Actually, out on Dorset Street, the street that I lived on at one time in the 60s. But it's interesting to see as I see all these little towns with their town greens and their Greek revivals and all those things, old burial grounds. South Burlington does not have a downtown center. They're trying to do that, obviously. They're trying to get some property, get some of those tax monies and stuff to put in the things that all these other little towns have had forever. I always like to finish when I talk about Vermont with this famous quote from somebody. I love Vermont because her hills and her valleys, her scenery and her invigorated climate. and this is really true, but most of all for indomitable people. I'm going to accuse you all of being Vermonters and being indomitable, but we are. I mean, we are, that's who we are, and we have been forever. We are indomitable. We look at the laws that we write, look at the independence that we still do to this day. I think it started with Ethan Allen when he said he wasn't going to let those Yorkers tell him what to do and take his property. But it is the truth, oftentimes with the innovative ones, and I just love that quote.